The sound of shattering glass echoed through the upscale, shooting range as another customer missed their target completely. Sarah Chun stood quietly in the corner, watching wealthy businessmen and weekend warriors waste ammunition while boasting about their imaginary military experiences. Her calloused hands, hidden beneath expensive manicured nails, told a different story than her designer clothes suggested. 27 kills. That's what her classified record showed. 27 confirmed eliminations across 3 tours in Afghanistan, each one a life-or-death moment where hesitation meant her team didn't come home. But tonight, she was just another pretty face in an expensive dress, trying to forget the nightmares that haunted her sleep. She had no idea that walking into this shooting range would change everything, that the arrogant man laughing too loudly at the next station would push her too far, that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with the deadly skills she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Some secrets refused to stay buried. And some people should never underestimate a woman who knows exactly how to kill with surgical precision. Sarah Chun adjusted the strap of her Hermes handbag and stepped through the polished glass doors of Elite Precision shooting range. The facility screamed money from every surface, with its marble floors, leather seating areas, and gleaming chrome fixtures. It was exactly the kind of place where wealthy executives came to play soldier for an hour before returning to their corner offices and expense account lunches. She had chosen this place specifically because it was the opposite of everything she remembered from her military days. No sand in her gear, no constant threat assessments, no weight of responsibility for keeping her teammates alive. Just clean walls, climate control, and the simple pleasure of putting holes in paper targets. It was supposed to be therapeutic, her counselor had said. A way to reconnect with something familiar while maintaining distance from the memories that kept her awake at night. The woman behind the counter looked up with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to handling clients who spent more on a single shooting session than most people earned in a week. Sarah's appearance fit perfectly into that demographic. Her black blazer was tailored to hide the lean muscle beneath, and her makeup had been applied with enough skill to soften the sharp angles that years of military discipline had carved into her features. "Good evening, Miss Chun," the attendant said, consulting her computer screen. "Your usual lane?" "Lane 12, if it's available," Sarah replied, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of her Texas upbringing. She had worked hard to develop this polished, professional tone during her transition to civilian life. It served her well in her current job as a corporate security consultant, where clients preferred their expertise delivered with a smile and without uncomfortable questions about how exactly she had acquired her knowledge. The range was busier than usual for a Thursday evening. Sarah counted 15 other shooters spread across the 40 available lanes, most of them clustered in the center sections where they could better show off for their companions. She preferred lane 12 because it was positioned at the far end, offering both privacy and an unobstructed view of the entire facility. Old habits, her therapist would have called it, but Sarah knew better than to sit with her back exposed, even in a controlled environment. She had been shooting for 20 minutes when he arrived. Marcus Holbrook made the kind of entrance that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His voice carried easily over the sound suppression barriers, announcing his presence to anyone within 50 feet. He was tall, probably 6'3", with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no. His expensive suit was cut to emphasize his broad shoulders, and his handshake with the range attendant lasted a few seconds too long, establishing dominance over someone he would never see again. "Set me up in your best lane," Marcus declared, pulling out a titanium credit card. "And I want your finest rifle. Something with real stopping power." Sarah continued her methodical practice routine, placing shot after shot in the center ring of her target 50 yards downrange. Her movements were economical, efficient, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. Breathe, acquire target, gentle squeeze, follow through. The rhythm was meditative, a connection to muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of training and refined under the worst possible conditions. Marcus had taken lane 8, directly in her line of sight. He was shooting a borrowed rifle that cost more than most people's cars, but his technique was amateur at best. His shots scattered across the target in a pattern that suggested more enthusiasm than skill. Between rounds, he kept glancing around the range, clearly hoping someone would notice his expensive equipment and impressive muzzle flash. "Excuse me, sweetheart," came a voice from behind her. Sarah didn't turn immediately. She finished her current magazine, carefully placed her rifle on the bench with the action open, and only then acknowledged the interruption. Marcus had approached her lane during a ceasefire, violating both range etiquette and basic safety protocols. "Can I help you?" she asked, removing her hearing protection. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he considered himself irresistible. "I couldn't help but notice you over here. Pretty lady like you shouldn't be shooting alone. Why don't you come over to my lane? I could show you how to really handle a rifle." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "I'm doing fine, thank you. Come on, don't be shy." Marcus pressed, stepping closer than social convention warranted. "I can see you're trying hard, but you're never going to improve with that technique. I've got military experience. Special forces, actually. I could teach you a thing or two." Sarah's gaze flicked to his hands, noting the soft palms and perfectly manicured nails. No calluses, no scars, no evidence of the hard use that marked anyone who had actually handled weapons professionally. His stance was wrong too. Weight distributed like someone who had learned to shoot from action movies rather than qualified instructors. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I prefer to shoot alone." Marcus laughed, the sound carrying an edge of condescension. "Look, honey, I get it. Shooting can be intimidating for beginners. But you're never going to hit anything meaningful at this distance. Why don't you move up to the 25-yard line? That's more appropriate for someone at your skill level." Several other shooters had begun to notice the conversation. Sarah was aware of them in her peripheral vision, a mix of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment radiating from their direction. She had encountered men like Marcus before, during her civilian transition. They saw an attractive woman and assumed incompetence, never considering that appearances might be carefully constructed rather than accidentally revealing. "I'm comfortable at 50 yards, Sarah replied evenly. 50 yards. Marcus's laugh was louder now, designed to include their growing audience. "Sweetheart, that's serious distance shooting. You need real training for that kind of precision work. Military training, which I happen to have." He gestured toward his own target, where his shots formed a loose group spanning roughly 8 inches. "See that? That's the kind of accuracy you develop in combat zones. Afghanistan, Iraq, classified missions I can't even talk about. But I could show you some basic techniques that might help you get on paper more consistently." Sarah followed his gesture, studying his target with the professional assessment that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. His grouping was adequate for recreational shooting, but would have earned him remedial training in any serious military context. The shot placement showed several fundamental errors in breathing, trigger control, and sight alignment. "Those are impressive groups," she said neutrally. Marcus preened under what he interpreted as admiration. "That's what happens when you've got natural talent backed up by professional training. Navy SEALs don't mess around when it comes to marksmanship. We're trained to put rounds exactly where they need to go, every time." Sarah's expression remained carefully neutral, but anyone who knew her well would have recognized the warning signs. Her shoulders had squared slightly, and her breathing had shifted to the controlled pattern she used for precision shooting. "Navy SEALs," she repeated. "That's right," Marcus said, warming to his fabricated story. "Can't talk about most of it, obviously. Classified operations, sensitive targets. But let's just say when the government needs something done quietly and efficiently, they call in the best." He moved closer to Sarah's bench, examining her equipment with theatrical interest. Her rifle was a custom build, precisely configured for long-range accuracy, but modest enough to avoid attracting attention. "This is a nice little gun," he said patronizingly. "Good choice for a beginner. Though if you really want to learn proper shooting, you need something with more authority." Sarah had been in similar situations before, dealing with men who mistook politeness for weakness and silence for submission. Her therapist had encouraged her to avoid confrontation, to walk away from situations that might trigger her more aggressive instincts. But something about Marcus's performance was particularly grating, perhaps because she had known real SEALs, had worked alongside genuine operators who would never dream of advertising their credentials to impress strangers. "I'm still learning," she said finally. Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Tell you what, why don't you take a shot at my target? Show me what you can do, and I'll give you some pointers." Professional instruction from someone who's actually been downrange. Other shooters were openly watching now, some with amused smiles at Marcus's obvious display, others with expressions of sympathy for the woman being subjected to his unwanted attention. The range safety officer was nowhere to be seen, probably dealing with some administrative task and unaware of the growing tension. Sarah considered her options. She could pack up her equipment and leave, avoiding confrontation, but also allowing Marcus to claim victory in whatever game he thought he was playing. She could continue to politely deflect his advances until he eventually lost interest. Or she could give him exactly what he was asking for. "You want me to shoot your target?" she asked. "Absolutely," Marcus said, his confidence reaching new heights. "Let's see what you can do with some real instruction. I'll talk you through the fundamentals." Sarah looked down the range toward Marcus's target, 50 yards away. His previous shots had clustered in a roughly oval pattern covering most of the 8 ring, with several flyers scattered into the 7 and 6 rings. It was the kind of grouping that looked impressive to civilians, but would have qualified as adequate at best in any serious shooting evaluation. "What exactly would you like me to hit?" she asked. Marcus grinned, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his moment of dominance. "Just try to get somewhere on the black. Don't worry about precision. Just focus on getting rounds on target. That's the first step in real marksmanship." Sarah nodded slowly, then turned to address her rifle. She had been shooting federal match ammunition, precisely loaded rounds that cost more per shot than Marcus probably realized. Her rifle was zeroed for exactly this distance, every component carefully selected and tested for optimal performance. She had been working methodically through her practice routine, but now she shifted into a different mode entirely. The first indication that something had changed was the way Sarah settled into her shooting position. Gone was the casual stance of a recreational shooter. Her body alignment shifted into the textbook form of someone trained by the best instructors in the world, every angle optimized for stability and control. Her breathing pattern changed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. She raised the rifle to her shoulder with movements that were both precise and fluid, the result of countless repetitions until the motion became as natural as breathing. Through the scope, Marcus's target came into sharp focus. Sarah could see every detail of the paper, every mark left by his previous shots, every tiny imperfection in the printing. "Remember," Marcus said from behind her, "just concentrate on getting close. Don't try to be fancy." Sarah's finger found the trigger, and she began the careful process of applying pressure while maintaining perfect sight alignment. Her world narrowed to the reticle, the target, and the sensation of the trigger's resistance against her finger. Everything else faded away, all sound and motion reduced to peripheral awareness. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that seemed louder than the previous shots. Sarah maintained her position for several seconds, following through as the recoil cycled the action. Then, she lowered the rifle and activated the target retrieval system, bringing Marcus's target downrange so they could examine the results. As the target traveled the length of the range, Marcus kept up a running commentary about proper breathing techniques and sight picture fundamentals. "The important thing is to stay relaxed," he said. "Don't try to force the shot. Let it happen naturally." The target reached the firing line, and Marcus reached out to examine Sarah's addition to his collection of holes. His commentary stopped abruptly. In the exact center of the target, cutting through the smallest ring, was a single bullet hole. Not just in the 10 ring, but dead center, so precisely placed that it could have been drawn there with a compass. Marcus stared at the target for several seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. Around them, other shooters had noticed the sudden silence and began to pay attention. Someone whistled appreciatively. "Lucky shot," Marcus said finally, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. Sarah had already begun preparing for her next round, loading another cartridge with practiced efficiency. "Should I try again?" she asked. Before Marcus could respond, Sarah had returned to her shooting position. This time, she didn't take as long to settle. The second shot followed within 30 seconds of the first, and once again the target was recalled for examination. The second hole was less than a quarter-inch from the first, so close that they almost overlapped. Together, they formed a group that could be covered by a dime. The level of precision was immediately recognizable to anyone with even basic knowledge of marksmanship as something far beyond recreational shooting. Marcus's face had gone pale. Should I continue?" Sarah interrupted, already loading a third round. A small crowd had begun to gather at the boundary of their lanes, drawn by the unusual level of precision they were witnessing. Sarah was aware of their attention, but didn't let it affect her focus. She fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, each one placed with surgical accuracy. When the target came downrange for the final time, it showed 5 bullet holes clustered within a space smaller than a quarter, all within the innermost ring. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before someone in the crowd began to clap. The applause spread quickly, accompanied by murmurs of appreciation and disbelief. Sarah calmly began to clean her rifle, her movements methodical and unhurried. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the target as if it might change if he looked hard enough. His carefully constructed persona had crumbled in the face of a demonstration that rendered all his boasting meaningless. Around them, other shooters were discussing what they had witnessed in tones of genuine respect. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Marcus asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah finished securing her rifle in its case before responding. When she looked at him, her expression was pleasant but unreadable. "You mentioned military training," she said. "That you could teach me proper technique." Yes, but..." Marcus struggled to form coherent sentences. "I'd be interested in hearing more about your Navy SEAL experience," Sarah continued. "Which teams did you serve with? I might know some of your teammates." Marcus's face went from pale to red. It's classified. I can't discuss operational details." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "Operational security is important. But surely you could mention which BUD/S class you graduated with? That's not classified information." The crowd around them had grown larger, and several people were clearly listening to the conversation with interest. Marcus looked around desperately, seeking an escape from the trap his own lies had constructed. "I should get going," he said abruptly, backing away from Sarah's lane. "Before you go," Sarah said, her voice still perfectly polite, "I wanted to ask your advice about something. You seem to know a lot about precision shooting." Marcus stopped, caught between his desire to escape and his inability to openly retreat from the expertise he had claimed. "I've been working on some longer-distance shots," Sarah continued. "Maybe you could help me understand the ballistics for a .308 round at 800 yards? Wind compensation, bullet drop, that kind of thing. The sort of calculations they teach in advanced sniper schools." Marcus's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Around them, the crowd waited with barely concealed amusement for his response to technical questions that any genuine military marksman would have answered reflexively. Sarah waited patiently, her expression innocent and expectant. She had no intention of humiliating Marcus beyond what his own behavior had already accomplished, but she was curious to see how far he would push his fabricated credentials when confronted with specific knowledge he couldn't possibly possess. Those are advanced topics," Marcus finally managed. "Very specialized information." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "I just thought, with your special forces background and all, you might be able to offer some insights. Maybe share some of the techniques you learned in sniper school." The trap was complete, and Marcus clearly recognized it. His elaborate fiction had been exposed not through direct confrontation, but through the simple expedient of demanding that he demonstrate the knowledge he claimed to possess. He gathered his equipment hastily, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the growing audience. "Maybe some other time," he muttered, heading toward the exit with as much dignity as he could salvage. Sarah watched him go, then turned back to her equipment. The crowd began to disperse, though several people approached to offer compliments on her shooting. She accepted their praise graciously but, without elaboration, maintaining the careful balance she had constructed between her current identity and her hidden past. As she packed the last of her gear, Sarah reflected on how quickly her carefully ordered evening had transformed into something else entirely. She had come to the range seeking peace and routine, but instead had been forced to reveal skills she preferred to keep hidden. The shooting itself had felt natural, almost therapeutic, but the attention it had attracted was exactly what she tried to avoid in her civilian life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her business partner, reminding her about their early morning meeting with a potential client. The corporate security consulting firm they had built together was successful enough to keep her comfortable, and it allowed her to use her military experience in ways that felt productive rather than destructive. But nights like this reminded her how thin the line was between her current life and the person she used to be. Sarah slung her rifle case over her shoulder and headed toward the exit. The range was quieter now, most of the evening crowd having departed for dinner or drinks or whatever other activities filled their civilian lives. As she passed the front desk, the attendant looked up with an expression of curious respect. "That was quite a demonstration," the young woman said. "Will we see you again next week?" "Probably," Sarah replied. Same time, same lane. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, a welcome change from the enclosed atmosphere of the shooting range. Sarah's car was parked under a streetlight, a modest sedan that matched her carefully cultivated image of professional competence without ostentation. She loaded her equipment into the trunk and stood for a moment, letting the cool air clear her head. The encounter with Marcus had stirred up memories she preferred to keep buried. Not the technical aspects of shooting, which had become as natural as breathing, but the psychological aftermath of using those skills in life-or-death situations. Her therapist had warned her that seemingly minor incidents could sometimes trigger unexpected emotional responses, especially when they involve the intersection of her military experience with her civilian identity. Sarah started her car and pulled out into the light evening traffic. She had a 40-minute drive back to her apartment, plenty of time to decompress and refocus on tomorrow's responsibilities. But, as she navigated the familiar streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during the evening's events. For 3 years, she had successfully maintained separation between her past and present. Tonight, that careful balance had been disrupted, and she wasn't entirely sure what the consequences might be. Sarah's apartment reflected the same careful balance she maintained in every aspect of her civilian life. Clean lines, neutral colors, and strategically placed personal touches that suggested depth without revealing too much. The framed photographs on her mantel showed her with college friends, work colleagues, and family members, but none from her military service. To any casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what her professional biography claimed: a successful security consultant with an MBA and a talent for helping corporations protect their assets. Only someone with trained eyes would notice the subtle indicators that marked her living space as belonging to someone with a very different background. The apartment's layout had been chosen for its single entrance and unobstructed sight lines. The furniture was positioned to provide clear fields of fire to all potential access points. Even her choice of neighborhood had been influenced by factors most people never considered: proximity to highways for rapid egress, limited through traffic, and neighbors who minded their own business. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her reading chair, a position that allowed her to monitor both the front door and the large windows overlooking the street below. She had 3 case files to review before her morning meeting, all potential clients seeking corporate security assessments. The work was lucrative and respectable, drawing on her military experience without requiring her to discuss the more sensitive aspects of her service record. Her phone rang at 9:30, displaying her business partner's name on the screen. David Martinez had served as a communications specialist during his own military career, though his experience had been significantly different from hers. He handled the technical aspects of their consulting business, while Sarah focused on threat assessment and strategic planning. "How was your therapy session?" David asked without preamble. They had developed the kind of friendship that dispensed with unnecessary pleasantries. "It wasn't therapy," Sarah replied. "It was target practice." "Same thing, according to your shrink. Did it help?" Sarah considered the question while swirling wine in her glass. "It was complicated." David's laugh carried the easy confidence of someone who had never killed anyone in the line of duty. "Let me guess. Some yahoo tried to mansplain shooting to you. Something like that. Please tell me you didn't completely destroy the poor bastard." Sarah described the evening's events in neutral terms, focusing on Marcus's behavior rather than her own response. David listened without interruption, though she could hear him trying to suppress laughter at several points. "So you put 5 rounds through the same hole?" he asked when she finished. "Close enough. And this guy claimed to be a Navy SEAL?" "Among other things." David whistled appreciatively. "I bet that was educational for him. Did you tell him who you really are?" "Of course not." Sarah's tone carried a hint of reproach. "I'm not trying to advertise." "Right, because God forbid anyone find out that Sarah Chun used to be the most feared sniper in the entire theater of operations. That might be bad for business." Sarah had heard this argument before. David believed she was unnecessarily secretive about her military service, hiding accomplishments that most people would wear as badges of honor. He didn't understand that her reputation in certain circles was exactly what made anonymity so valuable. There were people who might take a very unhealthy interest in knowing where to find the woman responsible for eliminating several high-value targets across multiple deployments. "Speaking of business," Sarah said, changing the subject, "tell me about tomorrow's client." "Hartwell Industries, manufacturing company based downtown, about 800 employees. They've been having some industrial espionage problems, and their insurance company recommended us for a comprehensive security assessment." Sarah accessed the preliminary files on her laptop while David continued his briefing. Hartwell Industries appeared to be exactly the kind of mid-sized corporation that formed the backbone of their client base. Successful enough to afford professional security consulting, but not large enough to maintain their own internal capabilities. "What kind of espionage?" she asked, scanning the company's organizational chart. "Classic stuff. Proprietary manufacturing processes, customer lists, things like that." Someone's been feeding information to their competitors, but they haven't been able to identify the source. Corporate wants a full vulnerability assessment with recommendations for enhanced security protocols. Sarah nodded, making notes on potential approaches. This was the kind of work she enjoyed. Complex enough to be intellectually stimulating, but removed from the life-or-death stakes that had characterized her previous career. Who's our primary contact? James Hartwell, the CEO. Second-generation family business. Reputation for treating employees well. From what I can tell, he's genuinely concerned about protecting his people as well as his company. Background check. Clean as a whistle. No red flags, no questionable associations. He seems like the real deal. Sarah finished reviewing the preliminary materials and closed her laptop. Sounds straightforward. What time is the meeting? 10 o'clock. I figured we'd do the usual routine. You handle threat assessment and strategic recommendations. I'll focus on technical vulnerabilities and implementation. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her wine and case files, but found herself distracted by the evening's events at the shooting range. The encounter with Marcus had been minor in objective terms, but it had disrupted the careful equilibrium she had spent 3 years constructing. She had revealed capabilities that raised questions she preferred not to answer, and done so in front of witnesses who might remember her face. Her therapist had warned her that the transition from military to civilian life would involve ongoing challenges, particularly for someone with her specialized background. Dr. Rebecca Foster was one of only a handful of mental health professionals with clearance to work with former special operations personnel, and she understood the unique pressures faced by veterans whose service records remained classified long after their discharge. The challenge, Dr. Foster had explained during one of their early sessions, is that you've developed a set of skills and instincts that served you extremely well in a specific environment. But those same capabilities can become liabilities in civilian contexts if you're not careful about how and when you use them. Sarah had initially resisted the therapy sessions, viewing them as an unnecessary complication in her transition process. But she had gradually come to appreciate Dr. Foster's insights into the psychological aftermath of her military service. The nightmares had decreased in frequency and intensity, and she had developed better coping strategies for managing the hypervigilance that made normal social interactions exhausting. Tonight's incident at the shooting range represented exactly the kind of situation Dr. Foster had warned her about. Sarah had allowed herself to be provoked into a demonstration that served no productive purpose and potentially exposed her to unwanted attention. The smart play would have been to ignore Marcus's provocations and leave quietly, avoiding any display that might distinguish her from the other recreational shooters. But she had to admit that putting those shots exactly where she intended had felt extraordinarily satisfying. For a few minutes, she had been able to stop pretending to be something she wasn't, and simply be the person 3 years of intensive training had created. The rifle had felt like an extension of her body. The target had presented no challenge whatsoever, and the familiar rhythm of precision shooting had quieted the background noise that seemed to follow her everywhere in civilian life. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Impressive shooting tonight. Would love to discuss your background over coffee. M. She stared at the message for several seconds before deleting it without responding. Marcus had apparently obtained her contact information from somewhere, probably the range's customer database, and was attempting to continue their interaction. The presumption involved in contacting her uninvited was typical of his behavior throughout the evening, but it also represented a potential security concern. Sarah had built her civilian identity carefully, using legitimate credentials and verifiable employment history while avoiding any paper trail that might connect her to her classified service record. Her business license, professional certifications, and educational transcripts all supported the narrative of a security consultant with general military experience. But persistent investigation by someone with the right resources could potentially uncover inconsistencies that might raise uncomfortable questions. She made a mental note to review her digital footprint and consider whether additional privacy measures might be warranted. The shooting range incident had been a momentary lapse in judgment, but she couldn't afford to compound the error by ignoring potential consequences. The next morning brought crisp October air and the familiar routine of preparing for a client meeting. Sarah chose her outfit carefully, as always, professional but not intimidating, competent but not militant. The navy blazer and gray slacks projected exactly the right image for a security consultant seeking to earn a corporate client's trust. Her makeup was applied with enough skill to soften her more angular features while maintaining an air of professional authority. Hartwell Industries occupied a modern office building in the city's business district, surrounded by the kind of gleaming towers that housed law firms, accounting practices, and consulting companies. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, using the extra time to conduct a preliminary assessment of the building's security arrangements. What she observed was typical for a mid-sized corporation: adequate physical security for normal business operations, but with several vulnerabilities that would concern someone tasked with protecting sensitive information. David met her in the lobby, carrying the leather portfolio that contained their standard presentation materials. They had worked together long enough to develop an effective partnership, with complementary skills and mutual respect for each other's expertise. David's technical knowledge was encyclopedic, while Sarah's strategic thinking had been honed by years of life-or-death decision-making. "Ready for this?" David asked as they waited for the elevator. "Always," Sarah replied, though she was still thinking about the previous evening's incident and its potential implications. James Hartwell's office occupied a corner of the building's 15th floor, with windows offering expansive views of the city skyline. The CEO himself was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he had inherited both his position and his sense of responsibility from his father. He greeted them personally rather than delegating the meeting to subordinates, immediately earning points in Sarah's assessment. "Thank you both for coming," Hartwell said, gesturing toward a conference table positioned near the windows. "I have to admit, this whole industrial espionage situation is completely outside my area of expertise." Sarah and David took seats across from Hartwell and his security director, a retired police detective named Frank Morrison, who had been with the company for 6 years. Morrison appeared competent enough within his limitations, but his experience was primarily in preventing theft and managing employee misconduct rather than sophisticated intelligence gathering. "Why don't you start by describing the specific incidents that have raised concerns?" Sarah suggested, opening her notebook. Hartwell exchanged glances with Morrison before responding. 3 separate instances over the past 4 months. In each case, our competitors somehow obtained detailed information about proprietary processes or strategic plans that should have been restricted to a very small group of people. David leaned forward with interest. "What kind of information, specifically?" "The first incident involved a new polymer formulation we'd spent 2 years developing. Our primary competitor announced a virtually identical product 3 weeks before our planned launch. The second was a customer acquisition strategy that somehow found its way to a rival company's sales team. Most recently, detailed specifications for our new manufacturing equipment were apparently shared with a competitor who used the information to undercut our bid for a major contract." Sarah made careful notes while evaluating the pattern Morrison described. The incidents suggested either a highly placed insider with broad access to sensitive information or a sophisticated external penetration of the company's information systems. Either possibility required careful investigation and a comprehensive response. "How many people had access to the compromised information?" she asked. Morrison consulted his own notes. "That's part of what makes this so frustrating. In the first case, maybe 15 people knew the complete details. The second incident involved information that was restricted to maybe 8 senior managers. The most recent breach involved technical specifications that were only shared with 4 people. Any overlap in personnel across the 3 incidents?" "Some," Hartwell admitted. "But we're talking about our most trusted employees, people who've been with the company for years. It's hard to imagine any of them deliberately betraying us." Sarah understood Hartwell's reluctance to suspect his own people, but experience had taught her that the most damaging security breaches often involve trusted insiders who had been compromised through various means. Financial pressure, blackmail, ideological motivation, or simple greed could turn anyone into a potential threat under the right circumstances. "We'll need to conduct a comprehensive review," she explained. "Personnel screening, electronic security assessment, physical security evaluation, and analysis of information handling protocols. The goal is to identify vulnerabilities and develop recommendations for enhanced protection." David opened his laptop and began outlining their technical capabilities. "We'll start with a complete audit of your IT infrastructure, looking for evidence of external penetration or unauthorized access. Network security, email systems, file servers, anything that might contain sensitive information." Sarah watched Hartwell and Morrison as David described their methodology. Both men appeared genuinely committed to solving the problem, though she could sense their discomfort with the implications of what they were discussing. Industrial espionage investigations often revealed uncomfortable truths about employee loyalty and organizational vulnerabilities. How long does this kind of assessment typically take? Hartwell asked. 2 to 3 weeks for the initial evaluation, Sarah replied. Longer if we discover evidence of ongoing penetration that requires detailed forensic analysis. The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details and contractual arrangements. Sarah found herself impressed with Hartwell's thoughtful questions and obvious concern for his employees' welfare. Too many executives focused solely on protecting corporate assets while ignoring the human costs of security breaches and investigations. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell asked a question that caught Sarah's attention. I don't mean to pry, but your approach seems more sophisticated than what I'd expect from typical corporate security consultants. Do you have specialized experience in this kind of work? Sarah maintained her professional expression while choosing her words carefully. David and I both have military backgrounds that included training in intelligence and counterintelligence operations. We've adapted those skills for commercial applications. It was a truthful answer that avoided revealing anything specific about her actual service record. Hartwell nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied with the general explanation. After leaving Hartwell Industries, Sarah and David stopped at a nearby coffee shop to discuss their initial impressions. The cafe was busy enough to provide acoustic cover for their conversation, while remaining sufficiently open to discourage eavesdropping. What did you think? David asked, stirring sugar into his espresso. Straightforward industrial espionage case, Sarah replied. Classic patterns, motivated target, obvious vulnerabilities. Should be interesting to investigate. Any gut feelings about internal versus external? Sarah considered the question while reviewing her notes. Too early to say definitively, but the pattern suggests someone with broad access to sensitive information. That usually points to an insider, either acting independently or under external coercion. David nodded agreement. The IT audit should tell us whether they've been penetrated electronically. If not, we're probably looking at a human intelligence operation. Either way, it's exactly the kind of case we handle well. Complex enough to be challenging, but well within our capabilities. As they finished their coffee and prepared to return to their office, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction at the prospect of engaging with a genuinely complex professional challenge. The Hartwell Industries case would require all of their skills and experience, providing the kind of intellectual stimulation that made civilian life fulfilling rather than merely tolerable. But, as they walked back to their car, Sarah noticed a familiar figure across the street, partially concealed by a bus stop advertisement. Marcus Holbrook was watching them with obvious interest, apparently having followed them from either their office or the Hartwell building. The surveillance was amateur hour, easily detected by anyone with basic training, but it represented an escalation from the previous evening's unwanted text message. Sarah didn't alter her pace or give any indication that she had noticed Marcus's presence, but her awareness shifted into a different mode entirely. The careful balance she had maintained between her past and present was being disrupted by someone too foolish to understand the potential consequences of his actions. She made a mental note to address the situation before it developed into something more serious. Everything okay? David asked, noticing the subtle change in her posture. Fine, Sarah replied. Just thinking about the Hartwell case. But, as they drove back to their office, Sarah found herself conducting the kind of tactical assessment she hadn't needed for 3 years. Marcus's behavior suggested either romantic obsession or something more concerning, and either possibility required careful management. She had worked too hard to build her civilian life to allow it to be compromised by some weekend warrior's inflated ego and poor judgment. The Hartwell Industries investigation began 3 days later with a comprehensive security assessment that would have impressed anyone familiar with military intelligence operations. Sarah and David arrived at the corporate headquarters before normal business hours, carrying equipment that looked innocuous but represented some of the most sophisticated surveillance detection technology available to civilian contractors. Sarah's military training had included extensive education in both offensive and defensive intelligence operations, skills that translated perfectly to corporate espionage investigations. The psychological principles remained the same whether the target was a terrorist cell in Afghanistan or a competitor seeking proprietary manufacturing processes. People who betrayed trust left patterns of behavior that could be detected and analyzed by someone who knew what to look for. The first phase involved establishing baseline security protocols and identifying potential vulnerabilities in Hartwell's information handling procedures. Sarah interviewed key personnel individually, using techniques designed to elicit honest responses while avoiding the confrontational atmosphere that might put employees on defensive alert. Her approach was professional but thorough, focusing on work routines, access protocols, and social relationships that might create security risks. David concentrated on the technical aspects, conducting a detailed audit of the company's IT infrastructure. His analysis revealed several concerning vulnerabilities, including inadequate network segmentation, weak password policies, and insufficient monitoring of data access patterns. While none of these issues constituted smoking gun evidence of a security breach, they created opportunities that a sophisticated adversary could potentially exploit. By the end of the first week, Sarah had developed a preliminary profile of the most likely threat scenarios. The pattern of compromised information suggested someone with legitimate access to sensitive materials across multiple departments, pointing toward either a senior executive or someone in a support role with broad system privileges. The timing of the breaches coincided with specific business decisions, suggesting that the perpetrator had advanced knowledge of corporate planning cycles. "I'm seeing three primary possibilities," Sarah explained during a private briefing with Hartwell and Morrison. First, a highly placed insider acting independently for financial gain. Second, an employee being coerced or manipulated by external actors. Third, a sophisticated electronic penetration that we haven't detected yet. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, clearly troubled by the implications. "How do we determine which scenario we're dealing with?" "Systematic elimination," Sarah replied. "We continue the technical analysis while implementing discrete monitoring of information access patterns. If we're dealing with an insider threat, they'll eventually make a mistake that reveals their identity." Morrison looked uncomfortable with the surveillance implications. "Are we talking about spying on our own employees?" "We're talking about protecting your company's legitimate interests," Sarah corrected. "Everyone who signed an employment agreement consented to reasonable security measures. What we're proposing falls well within normal corporate security protocols." David outlined the technical monitoring systems he could implement with minimal disruption to normal business operations. The approach was sophisticated enough to detect suspicious activity while remaining invisible to anyone without advanced technical knowledge. If someone was systematically accessing sensitive information for unauthorized purposes, the enhanced monitoring would eventually identify them. Hartwell approved the expanded investigation despite his obvious discomfort with the necessity. Sarah understood his reluctance to suspect his own employees, but she had seen too many organizations destroyed by misplaced trust to recommend any other approach. Industrial espionage was a business reality that required professional countermeasures. The second week brought the first significant breakthrough. David's monitoring systems detected unusual access patterns in the company's customer relationship management database, with someone systematically downloading client contact information during off hours when their activity was less likely to be noticed. The access log showed the queries originating from a legitimate user account, but the timing and scope suggested purposes beyond normal business requirements. "The account belongs to Jennifer Walsh in the sales department," David reported during their daily briefing. "She's been with the company for 4 years, good performance reviews, no obvious financial problems." Sarah reviewed Walsh's personnel file and interview notes. The woman appeared to be exactly what her record suggested, a competent sales representative with no apparent motive for betraying her employer. But Sarah had learned long ago that appearances could be deliberately constructed to conceal very different realities. "Let's expand our monitoring to include her communications and physical movements," Sarah decided. "But keep it discreet. If she's working with outside actors, we don't want to alert them that we're closing in." The expanded surveillance revealed a more complex picture than Sarah had initially expected. Walsh's electronic communications appeared normal, focusing on legitimate sales activities and routine personal correspondence. But her physical behavior showed subtle anomalies that suggested possible stress or anxiety. She had begun taking longer lunch breaks, making unusual trips to different parts of the building, and staying late on evenings when no specific business requirements justified the extra time. Sarah decided to conduct a direct interview under the pretext of routine security protocol review. She scheduled a meeting with Walsh in a conference room that David had equipped with discrete recording equipment, ensuring that they would capture both verbal responses and behavioral indicators that might reveal deception. Jennifer Walsh appeared nervous from the moment she entered the conference room, though Sarah recognized that her anxiety might stem from the general atmosphere of security investigation rather than specific guilt. Some people simply reacted poorly to any form of official scrutiny, regardless of their actual innocence or involvement. "Thank you for taking time to meet with me," Sarah began, using a tone designed to reduce rather than increase tension. "I'm reviewing our security protocols with various departments to ensure we're protecting sensitive information appropriately." Walsh nodded quickly, her hands fidgeting with a pen that she clicked repeatedly during the conversation. "Of course. I want to help however I can." Sarah proceeded through a series of routine questions about data access procedures, paying careful attention to Walsh's responses and body language. The woman's nervousness seemed genuine rather than calculated, suggesting someone under stress rather than someone attempting to conceal deliberate wrongdoing. "I noticed you've been accessing the customer database quite frequently in the evenings," Sarah mentioned casually. "Is that related to a specific project?" Walsh's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her face flushed, and she began speaking more rapidly than necessary. "I've been trying to catch up on follow-up calls with potential clients. The days get so busy with meetings and administrative tasks that I sometimes need to stay late to review account information." The explanation was plausible but didn't account for the systematic nature of Walsh's data access patterns. Someone genuinely reviewing client accounts for legitimate purposes would show more random access patterns, not the methodical progression that David's monitoring had detected. Sarah continued the interview for another 20 minutes, gradually increasing the specificity of her questions while maintaining a non-threatening demeanor. By the end of the session, she was convinced that Walsh was hiding something significant, though the exact nature of her deception remained unclear. After Walsh left the conference room, Sarah reviewed the recording with David, analyzing both the verbal content and visual indicators that might reveal additional information. Walsh's stress responses had been consistent throughout the interview, but had spiked noticeably when asked about her evening work schedule and database access patterns. "She's definitely hiding something," David concluded. "But I'm not convinced she's our primary suspect." Sarah agreed with his assessment. Walsh's behavior suggested someone caught up in a situation beyond her control rather than the mastermind behind a sophisticated industrial espionage operation. "Let's expand the monitoring to include her external contacts. If she's being coerced or manipulated, we need to identify who's controlling her actions." The breakthrough came 2 days later when David's monitoring systems detected Walsh receiving a phone call that significantly altered her subsequent behavior. The call lasted only 3 minutes, but afterward she immediately accessed the customer database and downloaded specific client information that matched no legitimate business requirement. David traced the incoming call to a number registered to a company called Meridian Strategic Solutions, a consulting firm that appeared to be a front organization with minimal legitimate business activity. Further investigation revealed that Meridian's primary client was Hartwell Industries' most aggressive competitor, a company that had benefited from each of the recent information breaches. "We've got our external controller," Sarah announced during an emergency briefing with Hartwell and Morrison. "Walsh is definitely being coerced into providing information, but she's working under duress rather than acting independently." Hartwell looked relieved that one of his employees wasn't voluntarily betraying the company, but concerned about the implications for Walsh's welfare. "What kind of coercion are we talking about?" "That's what we need to determine," Sarah replied. "But the pattern suggests classic intelligence operations methodology. They've identified a vulnerable employee and applied pressure to force cooperation." Sarah recommended a carefully coordinated approach that would protect Walsh while gathering evidence of the external conspiracy. Rather than confronting Walsh directly, they would provide her with false information designed to expose the extent of the espionage network and identify all participants in the operation. The plan required precise timing and careful coordination to avoid alerting the external controllers that their operation had been discovered. Sarah developed a disinformation package that would appear legitimate to Walsh, but contained subtle markers that would identify any subsequent use by Hartwell's competitors. David modified the monitoring systems to track the complete chain of information transfer from Walsh's initial access through whatever communication methods she used to relay data to her external handlers. The enhanced surveillance would provide definitive proof of the espionage operation while potentially identifying other employees who might be similarly compromised. 3 days later, Sarah's trap produced exactly the results she had anticipated. Walsh accessed the deliberately false information within hours of its placement in the customer database, and monitoring systems detected her transmitting the data through an encrypted communication application to contacts associated with Meridian Strategic Solutions. The evidence was overwhelming and legally actionable, providing Hartwell Industries with multiple options for addressing the security breach. But Sarah was more interested in the broader implications of what they had uncovered. Professional intelligence operations rarely targeted single companies unless the stakes were significantly higher than normal competitive advantage. This isn't just industrial espionage, Sarah explained during a final briefing with Hartwell and Morrison. Someone is running a systematic intelligence operation targeting multiple companies in your industry. Walsh is just one asset in a larger network. Hartwell absorbed this information with obvious concern. What do you recommend we do about it? Sarah outlined a comprehensive response plan that would protect Hartwell's interests while potentially disrupting the broader espionage network. The approach included legal action against the identified perpetrators, enhanced security protocols to prevent future breaches, and cooperation with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over interstate industrial espionage cases. The most important thing is to handle Walsh appropriately, Sarah emphasized. She's a victim as much as a perpetrator. The people who coerced her into this situation are the real criminals. The investigation had taken exactly 2 weeks, producing results that exceeded Hartwell's expectations and provided a template for protecting other potential targets. Sarah felt satisfied with both the professional outcome and the intellectual challenge the case had presented. This was exactly the kind of work that made her transition to civilian life feel purposeful rather than merely survivable. But as she packed up her equipment and prepared to leave Hartwell Industries, Sarah noticed something that immediately shifted her awareness into a different mode entirely. Marcus Holbrook was sitting in a car across the street from the corporate headquarters, apparently conducting surveillance on her movements. The amateur nature of his surveillance was almost insulting to someone with Sarah's training, but it represented an escalation that could no longer be ignored. Marcus had progressed from unwanted social contact to active stalking, behavior that suggested either romantic obsession or something more concerning. Sarah didn't alter her routine or give any indication that she had detected Marcus's presence, but she began conducting the kind of tactical assessment that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. Marcus's behavior pattern suggested someone whose fantasy life had become disconnected from reality, a psychological profile that could develop in dangerous directions without appropriate intervention. As she and David drove away from Hartwell Industries, Sarah made a decision that would have significant consequences for everyone involved. Marcus had made the mistake of interfering with her professional life, crossing a boundary that her military training had conditioned her to defend with overwhelming force. It was time to address his unwanted attention directly and decisively. "David," she said as they stopped at a traffic light, "I need to ask you a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that might require us to have a serious conversation about operational security and plausible deniability." David glanced at her with sudden alertness, recognizing the tone she used when discussing matters that required careful handling. "Does this have something to do with the guy who's been following us? You noticed him too?" "Sarah, the guy's about as subtle as a fire truck." "What's his story?" Sarah explained Marcus's escalating behavior while considering various approaches for resolving the situation. Her military training provided several options, ranging from simple deterrence to more permanent solutions. But her civilian identity required methods that wouldn't attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or create complications for her business. "So what's the plan?" David asked. "I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Holbrook," Sarah replied. "A very clear, very direct conversation that helps him understand the benefits of finding a different hobby." David nodded slowly, understanding that Sarah's definition of conversation might include elements that wouldn't occur to most people. "Need any assistance with this conversation?" "Not this time," Sarah said. "But I appreciate the offer." As they continued driving toward their office, Sarah began planning an intervention that would resolve the Marcus situation permanently while maintaining her carefully constructed civilian facade. It was time to remind herself and everyone else why certain people should never be underestimated, regardless of how harmless they might appear on the surface. Sarah spent the evening conducting the kind of intelligence preparation that had become second nature during her military service. Marcus Holbrook's digital footprint revealed a pattern of behavior that was both predictable and concerning, suggesting someone whose disconnect from reality extended well beyond his fabricated military credentials. His social media profiles painted the picture of a man desperate to project an image of success and competence that bore little resemblance to his actual circumstances. Marcus claimed executive positions at companies where employment records showed him working in junior administrative roles. His LinkedIn profile listed military service that had never occurred and educational achievements from institutions he had never attended. More troubling were the comments sections on various forums where Marcus engaged in increasingly aggressive exchanges with anyone who challenged his claimed expertise. His responses to criticism showed escalating anger and detailed fantasies about violent retribution against people who had supposedly wronged him. Sarah recognized the psychological pattern from her training in threat assessment. Someone constructing an elaborate fictional identity to compensate for profound feelings of inadequacy and failure. Marcus's financial records, obtained through methods that David preferred not to discuss, revealed mounting debt, recent job loss, and a pattern of increasingly desperate behavior. He was 3 months behind on rent, had maxed out several credit cards, and had recently been rejected for unemployment benefits due to termination for cause from his previous employment. Classic profile for someone susceptible to recruitment or manipulation, Sarah observed as she reviewed the intelligence summary. Financial pressure, social isolation, grandiose self-image that doesn't match reality. David had assembled the information with remarkable efficiency, drawing on resources that existed in the gray areas between legal research and electronic surveillance. The guy's a walking security risk. If someone wanted to turn him against you, they'd have plenty of leverage to work with. Sarah considered that possibility while reviewing Marcus's recent activities. His surveillance of her movements had become more sophisticated over the past week, suggesting either rapidly improving tradecraft or outside assistance from someone with actual experience. The amateur-hour mistakes that had initially made him easy to detect were being replaced by more professional techniques that required greater vigilance to identify. I think it's time for that conversation, Sarah decided. She had identified the optimal location for her intervention. The parking garage where Marcus kept his car, a semi-public space that would provide privacy for their discussion while remaining sufficiently visible to discourage any witnesses from interfering. The timing would be crucial, allowing her to approach Marcus when he was alone, but not so isolated that his disappearance might raise immediate questions. Sarah's approach to the problem drew on psychological warfare techniques developed for much deadlier purposes than dealing with civilian stalkers. The goal was to shatter Marcus's fictional self-image so completely that he would lose interest in pursuing someone who represented a threat to the fantasy identity he had constructed around himself. Marcus maintained a predictable schedule despite his unemployment, visiting a gym every Tuesday and Thursday evening, where he apparently spent considerable time maintaining the physical appearance that supported his fictional military background. The routine provided an ideal opportunity for interception, particularly since his route home passed through several areas where a private conversation could occur without interruption. On Thursday evening, Sarah positioned herself in the parking garage of Marcus's apartment building, having gained access through methods that would have impressed her former colleagues in special operations. She had dressed in civilian clothes that concealed both her identity and the various tools that might be required for different contingencies. Her appearance was unremarkable enough to avoid attracting attention while remaining professional enough to establish psychological dominance. Marcus arrived at precisely 7:30, following the routine that Sarah had observed throughout the previous week. He parked in his assigned space and began walking toward the elevator, apparently unaware that his evening was about to take a dramatic turn. Sarah allowed him to travel halfway across the parking garage before emerging from concealment behind a concrete support pillar. "Good evening, Marcus," she said in a tone that was pleasant but carried undertones that anyone with survival instincts would immediately recognize as dangerous. Marcus spun around with obvious surprise, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching panic as he realized how completely his own surveillance had been penetrated. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Sarah replied, moving closer with the kind of controlled movement that suggested overwhelming confidence in her ability to handle any situation that might develop. "About your new hobby." Marcus attempted to project the aggressive confidence that had characterized their first meeting, but his voice betrayed uncertainty about exactly how his fictional military background would help him in this particular situation. "I don't know what you mean." Sarah stopped exactly 6 feet away from Marcus, far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening, but close enough to demonstrate that she had chosen the distance rather than accepting whatever space he might prefer. Her positioning also ensured that she controlled his most direct escape route while maintaining awareness of potential threats from other directions. "Your surveillance technique needs work," Sarah observed conversationally. "Tuesday afternoon outside Hartwell Industries, Wednesday morning outside my office building, this morning outside my apartment." The blue sedan with the dented rear bumper isn't exactly subtle. Marcus's face flushed as he realized how completely his activities had been detected and cataloged. I wasn't. I was just... You were just conducting amateur hour stalking of someone you don't know anything about, Sarah interrupted. Which brings us to the purpose of our conversation. She moved slightly to her left, a casual adjustment that forced Marcus to reposition himself in a way that further limited his options while demonstrating that she controlled the geometry of their interaction. I'm going to tell you some things about my background, Marcus. Things that might help you understand why your current hobby represents a serious error in judgment. Marcus attempted to regain some psychological ground by reverting to his fictional military credentials. Look, I understand you're upset, but I'm trained to handle situations like this. Special Forces training includes... Stop, Sarah said in a tone that carried absolute authority. Just stop. The single word hit Marcus with sufficient psychological force to interrupt his rehearsed performance entirely. Sarah's voice had shifted into the command presence that had allowed her to maintain discipline among hardened combat veterans under the most stressful circumstances imaginable. My name is Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, formerly of the 3rd Special Forces Group, she continued in the same tone. Deployed to Afghanistan for 3 tours between 2019 and 2022. Sniper qualified with 27 confirmed kills during active combat operations. Marcus's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound as the implications of what he was hearing began to penetrate his fantasy world. Sarah allowed the silence to stretch long enough for her words to achieve maximum psychological impact before continuing. I spent 3 years hunting people significantly more dangerous than you across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, she said. I've killed men who were better trained, better equipped, and significantly more motivated than you could ever hope to be. Sarah took a single step closer, reducing the distance between them to exactly 4 feet. So when I tell you that your surveillance activities have been detected, cataloged, and evaluated, I want you to understand that this assessment comes from someone with professional expertise in exactly the kind of situation you think you're creating. Marcus had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized that his fictional military background was being confronted by someone with actual credentials that exceeded his wildest fabrications. I didn't know. I wasn't trying to. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah continued without acknowledging his attempted explanation. You're going to stop following me. You're going to stop calling me. You're going to stop driving past my office, my apartment, and any other location where I might be present. She paused to ensure that Marcus was tracking her instructions. You're going to delete my contact information from your phone, remove any photographs you may have taken during your surveillance activities, and forget that we ever met. Marcus nodded rapidly, apparently eager to agree to whatever terms might end this conversation as quickly as possible. But Sarah wasn't finished. I want you to understand the consequences of failing to follow these instructions, she said. If I detect any further surveillance, if I receive any additional contact from you, if you so much as drive past my office building accidentally, I'm going to treat you as a legitimate security threat. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Marcus to lean forward to hear her clearly. And I deal with security threats very directly, Marcus. Very permanently. The threat was implicit rather than explicit, carefully worded to avoid constituting a specific criminal act while leaving no doubt about her capabilities or intentions. Sarah had learned during her military service that psychological warfare was often more effective than physical force, particularly when dealing with individuals whose courage existed primarily in their imagination. Marcus was sweating now despite the cool evening air, his fantasy world crumbling under the weight of a reality that exceeded anything he was equipped to handle. I understand, he managed. I don't think you do, Sarah replied. So let me be more specific. She reached into her jacket and produced a manila folder containing printouts of Marcus's recent financial records, employment history, and social media activities. The mere existence of the documentation demonstrated a level of investigative capability that rendered his privacy completely illusory. I know where you live, where you work, what you drive, and how much money you owe, Sarah said as Marcus stared at the evidence of his completely compromised security. I know about your gambling debts, your credit card problems, and the real reason you were fired from your last 3 jobs. Marcus took an involuntary step backward as the full scope of his exposure became clear. How did you? I know that your military service consists entirely of 4 weeks of Army Reserve basic training that you failed to complete, Sarah continued relentlessly. I know that your claimed Special Forces experience exists only in online forums where you argue with actual veterans about tactics you've never practiced. She held up additional pages from the folder, each one representing another aspect of Marcus's life that had been thoroughly investigated and documented. I know about the restraining orders, the harassment complaints, and the pattern of stalking behavior that led to your termination from 3 separate employers. Marcus had backed up against his car, trapped between the vehicle and Sarah's psychological assault on the fictional identity he had constructed around himself. Please, I didn't mean, what you meant is irrelevant, Sarah said, closing the folder and returning it to her jacket. What matters is what you're going to do differently starting right now. She moved closer again, reducing the distance between them to less than 3 feet. Marcus pressed back against his car as if he could somehow escape through the metal. You're going to find a new hobby, Sarah said. Something that doesn't involve following people who are significantly more dangerous than you are capable of understanding. You're going to get professional help for whatever psychological issues have led you to develop elaborate fantasies about military service you never performed. Marcus nodded frantically, apparently willing to agree to anything that might end this encounter without further humiliation. And you're going to remember that this conversation never happened, Sarah continued. Because if word gets out that you've been stalking a woman and received a personal warning about your behavior, it might raise questions about your pattern of harassment that could result in law enforcement taking an official interest in your activities. Sarah stepped back to a more comfortable distance, allowing Marcus to breathe slightly more easily while maintaining complete psychological dominance over their interaction. Do we understand each other, Marcus? Yes, he whispered. Excellent, Sarah said, returning to the pleasant tone she had used at the beginning of their conversation. I'm glad we could have this discussion. She walked away without looking back, leaving Marcus standing next to his car in a state of psychological shock that would require considerable time to process. The intervention had achieved exactly its intended purpose, completely destroying Marcus's fictional military identity while demonstrating capabilities that rendered further stalking behavior unthinkable for anyone with basic survival instincts. Sarah returned to her own car and drove home through familiar streets, satisfied that she had resolved the Marcus situation in a manner that protected both her privacy and her civilian identity. The encounter had required her to reveal more about her background than she preferred, but only to someone whose credibility was so compromised that his testimony would carry little weight with any rational audience. As she settled into her apartment with a glass of wine and the evening news, Sarah reflected on how quickly her carefully ordered civilian life could be disrupted by people who failed to understand boundaries or consequences. The Marcus situation had been resolved efficiently, but it served as a reminder that her military past could never be completely separated from her current identity. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David. Everything resolved? Completely, Sarah replied. She spent the rest of the evening reviewing case files for their next client engagement, a pharmaceutical company concerned about industrial espionage in their research and development division. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, exactly the kind of civilian application for her military skills that made the transition feel worthwhile rather than merely necessary. But, as she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about the psychological profile that had made Marcus susceptible to stalking behavior in the first place. Financial pressure, social isolation, grandiose fantasies about military service he had never performed. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability that hostile intelligence services looked for when recruiting assets or identifying potential sources of information. The thought was troubling enough to prompt a mental note about conducting additional background research on anyone who showed unusual interest in her activities or professional affiliations. Marcus had been an amateur whose incompetence made him easy to handle, but more sophisticated surveillance might be conducted by people with actual training and resources. Sarah's military experience had taught her that threats often came from unexpected directions, and that maintaining security required constant vigilance even during periods of apparent calm. The Marcus situation was resolved, but the incident served as a useful reminder that her carefully constructed civilian life required ongoing protection from people who might see her skills and experience as valuable assets to be acquired rather than dangers to be avoided. 3 weeks after her confrontation with Marcus, Sarah had almost convinced herself that the incident was permanently resolved. Her morning routine had returned to its previous rhythm. Her business continued to thrive with challenging new clients, and the nightmares that had plagued her early transition to civilian life remained under control. The careful balance she had spent 3 years constructing seemed to have survived its most serious test. David had noticed the change in her demeanor during their weekly business meetings. "You seem more relaxed lately," he observed as they reviewed proposals for their next major contract. "The shooting therapy must be working." Sarah smiled at his reference to her weekly target practice sessions, which had become less about managing stress and more about maintaining skills that she hoped never to need again. Something like that. The elite precision shooting range had returned to its role as a peaceful retreat where she could practice marksmanship without the life-or-death pressure that had characterized her military service. The other patrons treated her with respectful distance, word having apparently spread about the woman who could put 5 shots through the same hole at 50 yards. No one bothered her with unwanted instruction or commentary about her technique. Their current caseload included 3 major corporations seeking comprehensive security assessments, a law firm requiring electronic surveillance detection, and a pharmaceutical company that suspected industrial espionage in their research division. The work was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding, drawing on her military experience without requiring her to discuss the classified operations that had shaped her skills. But on a Thursday evening that began like any other, Sarah's carefully ordered world was about to encounter a threat that made Marcus's amateur stalking look like a minor inconvenience. She was finishing her weekly shooting session when she noticed a woman watching her from the observation area behind the firing line. The stranger appeared to be in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of alert demeanor that suggested law enforcement or intelligence background. She had been present for the entire session, but hadn't engaged in any shooting herself, apparently content to observe Sarah's performance with obvious professional interest. Sarah completed her final magazine and began packing her equipment with the careful attention to detail that had become automatic during her military service. The woman in the observation area made no move to leave, apparently waiting for an opportunity to make contact. Her patience and positioning suggested someone accustomed to surveillance work, though her presence was obvious enough to avoid appearing threatening. "Impressive shooting," the woman said as Sarah secured her rifle case. "Thank you," Sarah replied neutrally, maintaining the polite but distant tone she used with strangers who showed unusual interest in her activities. "I'm Rebecca Martinez," the woman said, producing credentials that identified her as a federal agent with the Defense Intelligence Agency. "I was hoping we could have a conversation about your background." Sarah's awareness shifted immediately into a different mode, her military training recognizing the approach techniques used by intelligence professionals seeking to recruit or manipulate assets. Agent Martinez's credentials appeared legitimate, but Sarah had encountered sophisticated imposters during her overseas deployments who could produce convincing documentation for fictitious identities. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said carefully. Martinez smiled with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with former military personnel who had been trained to be suspicious of unexpected contact from government agencies. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, 3rd Special Forces Group, 27 confirmed kills across 3 combat deployments. Currently operating a corporate security consulting firm with David Martinez, formerly of the 82nd Airborne Division's Communications Section." The casual recitation of classified information served its intended purpose of establishing Martinez's legitimate access to Sarah's military records while demonstrating that her civilian identity provided no real anonymity from people with appropriate security clearances. Sarah recognized the psychological technique, but couldn't ignore its effectiveness. "What can I do for you, Agent Martinez?" Sarah asked. "There's a situation developing that could benefit from your particular expertise," Martinez replied. "A matter of national security that falls outside normal law enforcement channels." Sarah had been approached by government recruiters twice during her transition to civilian life, both times declining opportunities to return to active service in various capacities. Her decision to pursue civilian employment had been carefully considered and remained firm despite occasional second thoughts about whether her skills might be better utilized in government service. "I'm not interested in returning to military service," Sarah said. "This isn't about military service," Martinez clarified. "We're looking for someone with your specific background to assist with a sensitive investigation that requires capabilities not typically available through conventional law enforcement." Martinez gestured toward the shooting range's seating area, suggesting they continue their conversation in a more private setting. Sarah hesitated for a moment before agreeing, her curiosity overcoming her preference for avoiding government entanglements that might complicate her civilian life. They settled into chairs positioned to provide a clear view of the entire facility while offering acoustic privacy for sensitive discussions. Martinez opened a leather portfolio and produced documents that bore classification markings Sarah recognized from her military service. "What I'm about to share with you is classified," Martinez began. "But your security clearance remains active pending possible future requirements, so I'm authorized to discuss certain operational details." Sarah's security clearance had been a subject of ongoing concern during her transition to civilian life. The classified nature of her military service created complications for background checks required by potential employers, forcing her to rely on carefully sanitized summaries that omitted most operational details. Learning that her clearance remained active raised questions about why the government had maintained her access to classified information. 3 months ago, Martinez continued, "We identified a sophisticated espionage network targeting defense contractors and government agencies involved in classified research. The operation shows characteristics of professional intelligence services, possibly foreign-sponsored, with capabilities that exceed anything we've seen from traditional industrial espionage." Sarah reviewed the preliminary intelligence summary that Martinez provided, noting operational details that suggested adversaries with significant resources and advanced training. The described activities went far beyond the corporate espionage she had investigated at Hartwell Industries, involving sophisticated penetration of facilities with advanced security measures and extraction of information relating to national defense projects. "The network has been responsible for at least 12 confirmed security breaches," Martinez explained. "Stolen research data, compromised personnel information, and intelligence about classified military programs. The losses are significant enough to impact national security, but the perpetrators have been extremely careful to avoid leaving evidence that might lead to their identification." Sarah studied photographs of the targeted facilities and summaries of the stolen information. The patterns suggested adversaries with detailed knowledge of American security procedures and access to resources that extended well beyond typical criminal organizations. Several of the targeted projects involved technologies that she had encountered during her military service, weapons systems, and communication equipment that represented critical advantages in modern warfare. "What does this have to do with me?" Sarah asked. Martinez turned to